Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Tim McManus, the Chief Operating Officer at the Partnership for Public Service. It's my honor to welcome you all to our celebration of Public Service Recognition Week. Since 1985, the President and Congress have marked the first full week in May as Public Service Recognition Week, or PSRW, a time to honor the more than 20 million public servants at all levels of government: federal, state, county, local, and tribal. Public servants may go their entire lifetime and their entire career without being recognized. Worse yet, they may even be demonized. While PSRW is only a single week during the year, it is a special time to celebrate and appreciate the hard work and dedication of all public servants and acknowledge the invaluable contributions to communities and to democracy that public servants make every day. Bottom line, for all you public servants, this celebration is for you and what you do. It's through your dedication to public service that trust in government is rebuilt, communities are strengthened, and the public's needs are met. From all of us at the Partnership for Public Service, thank you for everything that you do each and every day. It's my privilege today to also introduce you to the moderator and the panelists for today's celebration. Our moderator today is Nancy Marshall-Genzer. Nancy covers Washington, D.C. for Marketplace and has reported on everything from homelessness to government shutdowns and the history of the Fed. In other words, she's a busy woman. Prior to joining Marketplace, Nancy worked for the NPR newscast unit and at WAMU, an NPR affiliate in Washington. In 2023, Nancy was honored with a Gracie Award, an award to celebrate and honor programming created for women, by women, and about women, for a story about how pediatricians were coping with the end of the federal government's COVID-19 public health emergency. Nancy, welcome and thank you for moderating the panel today. I also want to take a moment to introduce and thank our panelists joining us to share their perspectives, their stories, and their insights on how federal services have helped boost community development across the country are Todd Fisher, the Chief Investment Officer of the CHIPS Program Office, Carolee Wenderoth, the Tribal Engagement Coordinator at the U.S. Economic Development Administration, and Jim Cunningham, the Deputy Regional Administrator for the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Region 5. Jim, Todd, and Carolee, to you as well. Thank you for all that you do in every day working for the federal government. And thank you for being a part of today's event. Finally, I want to again thank all the public servants that have been able to join us here this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you are, for all that you do in your day-to-day work to strengthen our communities and our nation. Thank you.
All right, we're going to use the next 55 minutes to get to know Carolee, Todd, and Jim a little bit. I'm going to be asking them what they do and how they do it. If you have questions, please put them in the chat because we're going to reserve the last 15 minutes or so for audience questions. So we definitely welcome your questions. Carolee, you are the first victim. And I'm going to start with a pretty broad question. Tell us a little bit about your work, specifically how it relates to federal funding for tribal communities and other Indigenous groups.
Thank you for the question, Nancy, and thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to this conversation today. And thank you to all the public servants as well that are out there. My role at EDA this is the first time that EDA's hired this position. So as the office is built out and evolves, it's packed with it a few different avenues. But I believe where it comes to federal funding, the important part of this position is to really dial in on outreach, making sure we increase our network and our to our stakeholders so that there's access to our funding, they know how to access it. And some of the things that we have been able to do, one of my roles is I am a subject matter expert for the Bureau on Policy. We've had some consultations where we were able to actually change some program design, increasing the eligibility to our tribal partners that would otherwise have a little bit more challenge in accessing the funding. So my role is really to be that conduit. between the programs that are out there and the face that the tribes are at the table when it comes to program design. We work on we have 6 regional offices around the country, and we have wonderful, wonderful specialists that are foot on the ground. There are boots on the ground that work in tribal communities every day. So one of my other goals is to really ensure that they have the confidence and they have the tools that help them go into tribal communities if it is unfamiliar territory to them. And so by being able to increase those relationships and foster those relationships, it does increase that accessibility. It does increase the response rate that we're seeing from tribal communities when it comes to any impediments that they're seeing when they're out there looking for federal funding. I make sure that our staff is armed with the knowledge that they need to help with access. This includes things like Executive Order 13175, where there's a waiver clause. This includes the newest Executive Order 14112 that we're in implementation mode right now. When our staff is aware of these types of issues, these types of executive orders, these types of policies that are out there to benefit tribal access, it makes our team stronger with our approach to the impact that we can make at the end of the day with tribal communities being able to access the federal funding. So my role it's dynamic. I love it. It's unique, and I bear sole responsibility humbly that I've been chosen to be the first at EDA to build this out and get this memorialized. So it continues on. We've been blessed with a number of dollars in the last few years, and being a part of EDA's team to help get this to the ground and helping tribal communities access it has just been a bonus. And I really feel like my role is to be that face for tribal communities, to know that when they do have question, whether that's something on access, whether it's implementation, I get to be that guiding force to get them to the right contact, to make sure that we have execution on the ground so that they feel heard and they feel like they're accessing our funds competitively the way that any other applicant would have it. So that's basically my role in a nutshell. It was kind of like very high overview. There's a lot of moving parts that go within that, but in a sense, I am really there to be that conduit between the tribal community and EDA in a number of different ways.
And we are going to get to some of those moving parts. Don't worry, Carolee. But next, we're going to talk to Todd Fisher. And again, he's currently Chief Investment Officer at the CHIPS Program Office at the Department of Commerce. Todd, a super broad question for you. Tell us about your experiences helping oversee some major federal investments for state and local communities.
Thank you, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I have been in federal government. This is my middle of my 3rd year. I spent the bulk of my career in the private sector. The first year of that, actually, Carolee and I worked together. So I was at the EDA overseeing the American Rescue Plan funds to broadly invest in communities across the country. The 2 most well-known of those programs was the Good Jobs Challenge and the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, which were dramatically focused on generating as much interest and demand and outreach to as many communities across the country as possible. That's why, Carolee was brought into the EDA as that first tribal community coordinator, so that we could do more outreach to communities that had not engaged as much, were at the earlier stages of their evolution of either workforce or economic development. And the whole goal of that broader effort was to activate multiple communities, multiple populations within those communities, and make the connections and build capacity in those communities. So, for example, the Good Jobs Challenge was structured in a way where you could apply either as a workforce system that had a long-standing history of exceptional experience, but also someone who is at a much earlier stage of developing those connectivity across the communities of becoming a workforce system. And we were able to serve both of those ends of the spectrum because our goal was a broader, more inclusive economic development. So that was a very sort of focused effort across communities to build that capacity. I moved to CHIPS at the very beginning when the CHIPS Act was passed in August of 2022. We were just finishing up some of the investment of the American Rescue Plan, and I moved to CHIPS at the front end of that. CHIPS is different in the sense that we are maniacally focused on our national security and supply chain resiliency requirements in this country by building a sustainable, reliable semiconductor ecosystem. These fabs and this ecosystem are very large and will therefore be in more targeted communities and not spread across the country in the same way as our efforts with EDA were. And so here are our efforts, and we can talk more about this, but what we do require to come into our program is that you have a state or local incentive, and therefore most of the companies that come and apply to CHIPS already have chosen their site in a community. Our job is therefore to really make sure that the development of a given fab or manufacturing facility in Phoenix, Arizona is done in a way that's inclusive, that's consistent with the region's economic development roadmap, that connects the dots between the state and local and county and federal stakeholders who are all involved, and really helps to speed the path to get really effective sort of ecosystems evolve. That means breaking down barriers, whether that's around environmental or permitting or workforce or other aspects of that, or whether that's about helping these communities to build the ties that bind, if you will, to make sure that what ends up happening is communities are drawing suppliers to the community, small businesses, restaurants, infrastructure, et cetera, so that when we look back 10 years from now, what we see is really robust economic development that is inclusive for all.
And you probably know this, but in case you don't, a fab is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, but as I understand it, a fab is a factory that makes computer chips.
That is
right?
exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
Please stop me anytime I use nomenclature.
I will. Okay, last but not least, Jim Cunningham. Jim, a broad question for you. So as Deputy Regional Administrator responsible for coordinating delivery of HUD programs in the Great Lakes region, what is your day-to-day like? And maybe tell us about a few of the White House initiatives you've been involved with.
Certainly, and thank you for the question, and thank you to all my fellow public servants that serve the American people each and every day. It's great to be recognized, and thank you for your work. So if you want me to describe my day, every day is different. So that's the beauty of being a deputy regional administrator. But first, we kind of oversee the operations. We have a 6-state region, so we cover the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So we have field offices in each of those states, 2 in Ohio and 1 in each and every other state. So we kind of see the day-to-day operations, make sure that the lights are on and that we're running. So I have staff in each of those 6 states. But we also are the front door to HUD. And so in my office, we have a regional administrator that's appointed by the president. So she carries out the White House initiatives throughout our region, and we support her in doing that. We also are responsible for customer service, and so we have operator people, whether they call in or walk into our offices, we make sure that they are getting the service that they need in accessing HUD programs, or if they're already involved in HUD programs, if they're having issues, we try to get those resolved. I like to say that we're in the office that's called Field Policy and Management. So we don't run programs. We have people that run our community development programs, our public housing programs, but we're the front door to HUD. So we work with our local elected officials or congressional delegations to make sure that our programs are running efficiently. We do a lot of problem solving, and we carry out, as you mentioned, White House initiatives. So we have kind of 4 basic core strategic initiatives are part of our strategic plan. One is to support underserved communities. The second is to ensure access to and increase the production of affordable housing. We also promote home ownership, and then we also advance sustainable communities. So I kind of want to talk about how we ensure access and increase the production of affordable housing. So we serve over 1 million households in our programs, whether through our public housing program, our voucher programs, or our multifamily assisted housing. And one of the things is to make sure that those programs are operated efficiently, and that folks receiving HUD assistance live in decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So if we have operators that are not meeting our standards, we make sure we work with them to try to correct the deficiencies and make sure that our folks are living in appropriate housing, this type of housing that you and I want to live in. So we spend a lot of time making sure that that our program recipients are meeting our HUD standards. But the other is also ensuring access to housing. And one of the things that we try to do is make sure our voucher programs, and we have a traditional voucher program, which allows folks to receive assistance and then obtain rental housing on the open market. So we require housing authorities, we work with them to issue the vouchers, they have the clients, but then the clients have to go out and find housing on their own, where they sign a lease with a private landlord just like anyone else would on the private market. Sometimes there's a difficulty given the rental market. Everyone, you hear it in the news all the day that affordable housing is hard to find. And so there's competition in the rental housing market. So we work with our housing authorities to make sure folks can access affordable housing, that they can use their vouchers. So it's no good if we have a resource that once people get it, they can't use. So we do, on a typical day, we may go out, do landlord outreach and tell them about our programs. And because sometimes some folks don't want to use, they say, I'm not going to rent to a voucher holder. It's too much paperwork. But we go out and we try to educate landlords that this is a good deal. You get guaranteed rent. You get a renter that's been screened by a housing authority, and we make sure we go out and inspect to make sure it meets all of our standards. So we do some of that, and we also have special purpose vouchers to work with special populations, which I think we want to talk about a little bit later. But we either work with persons with disabilities, veterans that are experiencing homelessness, and so and foster youth, for example, that we actually work with to provide housing vouchers, but we also work with partners that provide supportive services. So we try to educate folks on how these renters are really good for our community and they need to be housed. So that's just one example of many things that we do over the course of a time, and some of the White House initiatives that we have been working on, not only here in Region 5, but across the country at HUD.
I can imagine your day-to-day is pretty crazy in this housing market. So thank you for what you do. Carolee, I want to drill down a little bit more. You said you're a conduit between Indigenous communities, Native Americans, and helping them find the federal funding that they can apply for. How do you work with other federal agencies to do that?
So I'm on a number of interagency working groups, and one of them is the White House Council on Native American Affairs, but there's a couple other working groups where we meet either monthly or twice a month, and it really gives a community feel of what's out there, what's available, how we can stack our resources to make them maximize the effectiveness of those. And then once we know, when we meet, we know what the initiatives are coming out of both the White House, but then within our own departments, we know what goals we're aligned because we meet so often. We can sort of pair up those resources. We've put together a clearinghouse of resources that's available online. And then we share each other's information out quite a bit. We have a newsletter here at EDA that is Indigenous specific, and I do share out as many resources as I can from other agencies. But through those working groups, it really does give a great landscape and a pulse on what's happening and who's applying for what, who's ready for what, and then how do we work together behind the scenes to ensure that they know what all the resources are available to them to meet the goal that they're reaching. And so through those collaborations, we've had success in a number of different ways about matching up tribal communities with different funding resources, whether that's through EDA or through energy, through Department of Transportation, HUD, USDA. We've been able to have a myriad of resources available out now and have conversations in real time about how to further or advance their economic goals by stacking resources. So those interagency working groups are the primary way that I'm communicating out and rating things with other federal agencies, whether that's through conversation, finding the convenings that make the most sense to attend, making sure that our stakeholders know what's out there as far as those convenings, and then the resources themselves with their timelines, their deadlines, those types of things. Those are the conversations being held that have proven over the last year, especially super helpful to a number of tribal communities that before were struggling with how to identify which funding pot to go after, because there have been so many in the last few years between all of the different efforts, which is a great thing, but it can also be stress. And so being able to help the conversation flow by knowing what each agency is up to has really made that conversation easier to have with tribal communities.
You can really direct them to the right agency that'll help them the most.
Correct.
Awesome. Great. Todd, a question for you about CHIPS. I've read that CHIPS program estimates building and operating the fabs, the semiconductor production facilities, could require more than 100,000 construction workers and 900,000 workers just to keep them going. So how are you finding and training that skilled workforce in this tight labor market?
Yeah, look, I think that is one of the critical success factors for CHIPS. I mean, the reality is over many years, we lost our manufacturing edge for semiconductors, not only semiconductors, but particularly semiconductors in this country. That also means we lost the workforce and the skills required to operate. So I do believe that it is complicated to find, to train, to recruit the workers required to build the kind of, I mean, we've got over $300 billion of announced facilities at this point, which are going to are already requiring massive numbers of construction workers. Many of those workers are highly skilled, whether they're highly skilled welders or electricians. And then similarly, in the fab itself, the types of workers are, also quite skilled, but can be trained, whether you're a high school graduate, a community college graduate, or, a PhD material engineer. And this country needs many of them. And that the aspect of workforce development is sort of my passion. After I left the private sector, I spent 4 years in the not-for-profit sector with a major workforce organization. When I joined the EDA, as I said earlier, a big part of my job was workforce development. And now here within CHIPS, that success factors of workforce development. And so we have a team within CHIPS really focused on accessing, connecting good programs across the country in community colleges and universities, in training organizations, sort of getting best practices out there. And really importantly, the application process itself requires very specific plans around both the construction workforce and the facility workforce, including things like childcare that were important to us because it meant you could expand the workforce, particularly to women and working families, by helping to push solutions that break down barriers to workforce development. And so our team, first, we get those plans. They are written into our agreements in terms of how these companies will go about making sure that they develop that pipeline for workforce. And then we are actively working with those companies, with those regions, with individual organizations, community colleges, et cetera, to help make sure that infrastructure gets created so that over the next decade, we are creating a long-term sustainable pipeline of workers, both in the construction and facility workforce.
These are new skills. We haven't had that many fabs in this country. So thank you, Todd. Jim, back to you. You mentioned some of the communities that you've worked with. I want to talk about veterans. So can you talk about the eligibility requirements and the overall application process for veterans who are experiencing homelessness?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think that it's probably one of the most important programs that we run at HUD to serve those that have served our country and come home and are experiencing troubles in accessing the housing market. So the biggest thing we have a program called the Veterans Administration supportive housing program. So it's a partnership with Veterans Affairs agency. So the vet actually has to be enrolled in services through a local VA medical center. That's one first. They have to be experiencing homelessness, and because of that, they are income qualified to receive our VASH voucher. So the way it works is in partnership with the VA, we determine the needs across the country, and then we issue allotments of VASH vouchers to local housing authorities, and that's kind of the HUD direction. So we oversee them and fund the housing authorities, so they are given an allocation. And then, so the veterans have caseworkers at the VA medical centers that actually work and refer those folks to their local housing authority partners. So it's a kind of a partnership where the VA will in turn refer to a local housing authority. The housing authority will issue the voucher, and then the caseworker will help that veteran find housing. And again, that's kind of the vital part, is kind of as long as they're in connected service with the VA, then they are able to access the voucher as long as there's an allocation. Obviously, there's limited resources, but once they make that connection, the biggest part is actually then finding housing on, again, the open housing market, the open rental market.
Yeah, it's a crazy market. So you're really working across agencies too. That's interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Carolee, back to you. I want to talk about some of the challenges. So what's working well, what's not working well for tribes who are seeking federal funding? What challenges have they come up against, and have you made any changes to help them over those challenges?
So anytime anybody's going after any type of federal funding, it always exhausts resources, especially at the level of funding that's been made available over the last couple of years. It can be quite burdensome, both human capital, but also the financial capacity. And when we're talking about tribes, that is a real piece of the conversation that becomes real when trying to go after funding. EDA had a tribal consultation in 2021. And out of that consultation, EDA made a federal rule change where they decided to make for-profit corporations that are wholly owned by and for the benefit of a tribe eligible to apply for EDA funding, which did increase that eligibility substantially and really opened up an economic arm from the tribal governments to go after funding, which then it alleviates that financial burden of the tribal government having to solely go after this on their own. So that was a huge step for EDA. That is still a federal rule change that we apply today. The majority of our funding is 100% grant rate, which means matching is not a requirement for tribal. There's a couple of programs that we have that do have a match requirement, but that's few and far in between. And we can also then lean back on some of the tools that we know already about 13175, that executive order. Then we have a number of programs that we did recently through one of them, which was our Recompete program. We did another tribal consultation. There was some data requirements along those. Through consultation, we ended up changing the program design a little bit to accommodate, which allowed tribes to enter their data using self-certification, which was a brand new step for EDA. It did increase that eligibility, and we saw a number of tribal applications come through the door, which was super exciting for EDA because that was a very highly competitive program. And with that program design, which it also included 100% grant rate, it increased the eligibility pool of those who could apply. So there's a number of steps that EDA has taken just in the last couple of years to really try to widen the footprint that we have throughout Indian country. Taking a look now at our RLF program, looking at ways to increase the footprint there, because that's an important piece of the access to capital question. And if we can make some significant movement there and really get that tool out into Indian country as a way to access capital, that is supposed to be a gap between those that can get conventional lending and those that are struggling to find those places where they can gain capital. Us being able to go out, have meetings the Build Back Better had a winner, a finalist who is out there making a mark right now. Their whole goal is around native CDFIs. That coalition is trying to spearhead an effort to really increase the knowledge behind the conventional banking standards and why those are impediments for tribes. And so that grantee right now is really making a strong push, and our RLF program has their eyes wide open on this, and it's been a wonderful experience to see. But these are just some of the latest things that EDA has done to try to erase some of the impediments that we all know exist behind accessing federal funding. Taking a look at our reporting requirements moving forward, there's conversation there. And so there's just a number of ways that we're trying to be more flexible, especially as Executive Order 14112 is now in implementation mode, really trying to be innovative and creative about what we can do to increase flexibilities so federal funding isn't such a burden on tribal communities and tribal governments. This is an important piece that I want to bring to the table for EDA and make sure that it's on the front burner in conversations moving forward for both program design and for policy. So again, these are just some of the areas that we're looking at, but I think monumental changes.
And CDFIs, correct me if I'm wrong, Carolee, are community development investment funds.
Close. They're the community development financial.
So
Yeah,
they'll help.
institution.
They'll
Yeah,
have people who, for example,
financial
have
institution. Yeah,
a traditional credit score get credit.
right. It's another access of funding or credit. Yeah.
Great. Todd, back to you. I know that this process is at the very, very beginning, but do you have any thoughts on when these fabs might open? When might the first one open? Do you have a goal? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I think what we've said, first of all, over the last handful of weeks, we have made some very significant announcements at CHIPS, where we have announced, up to 80% of our funding, particularly to 4 major companies: Intel, TSMC, Samsung, Micron. So I would say we're not quite at the early innings. We're quite along the way of sort of allocating money. However, allocating and actually having money leave the door and having these fabs built and workers in them and producing chips at scale is still multiple years off. These are literally the most complicated manufacturing sites in the world, right? If you were ever on a site like this, you're talking one fab could be 11 football fields. These are massive facilities that are at scale, that require precision like no other product in the world. And so the complexity of getting them up and running and then getting them at capacity and producing is a multi-year process. Some of the good news about CHIPS is the announcement the president made, and when we passed the CHIPS Act, already incentivized and instigated a number of announcements and got companies to start already constructing their facilities here. And so, for example, TSMC is well along on their first fab in Arizona, which should be producing chips over the course of this year, early next year. They've announced that. They've also announced Fab 2 and Fab 3, which will be, many years over the next, 4 or 5 years. Similarly to Samsung, that has been constructing their first fab. They've also announced a second fab and an R&D facility and an advanced packaging facility. So I expect that some of these facilities will be operating and producing chips as soon as the end of this year and next year, and some of them will take through the end of the decade. We have said that, for example, in leading edge semiconductors, which are the most critical semiconductors for things like AI, for example, what you hear about NVIDIA GPUs or Apple iPhones or whatever it is, that we will go from 0%. Today, we manufacture 0% of those chips. 90% plus has been manufactured in Taiwan, hence the need for the CHIPS Act. By the end of this decade, our target is to get to 20% of those chips manufactured in the US, and we are on target to do that.
Yeah, I think I read that Arizona facility is 3 football fields long. So
Yeah, for sure. And then wide, when you add it all up, these facilities, depending on them, are between 7 and 11 football fields apiece. And there might be multiple facilities on a given site. So these are truly, there are something to behold when you go and you visit them. And some of these, like the most advanced machinery in these facilities, these EUV machines that are made by ASML, this Dutch company, some of those machines cost $300-400 million a piece. So these are really exceptional facilities. They cost $20+ billion to construct. So this is complicated stuff.
Major investment. Jim, I've got one other question about veterans for you. Can you tell me what are the challenges and hurdles that you see facing veterans? And what have you done to help them succeed? I mean, what if somebody doesn't want to enroll with the VA? I mean, I'm just thinking about challenges that you might face with them.
So I think there's a couple things that I think that we work with. So the VASH program is not the only one that is available to anyone experiencing homelessness, and we know that one of the demographics in our just our general homeless population are those that have served our country in the armed services. So we provide funding to local continuum of care organizations that serve the entire homeless population, those experiencing or living on the streets, living in cars. So our goal, I mean, we know that we've done a great job in reducing veterans' homelessness over time. We had to have a priority to do that. Now we're working on just in general unsheltered homelessness. So we have evolved over my career. It's hard to believe that next month will be 33 years of service. So to actually find ways to continue to improve. So we work with a housing first model to try to make sure that we are getting folks into housing and then providing services, eliminating the barriers to that. So that has worked with our veterans population. The other thing that I think that I mentioned earlier is that just finding housing, right? And so one of the things that we have done is to work with our housing authorities to find innovative ways to make it easier to get placed once you have one of these resources. So we have done project-based vouchers, and one of the reasons that I really wanted to, we just did a facility in my hometown last month of a place that they were looking to figure out how they could use their HUD VASH vouchers, and they came to HUD and we're looking for innovative ways to do it. So they ended up what we call project basing, which is assigning those VASH vouchers to a specific site. And this, again, it was in my hometown, and it happened to be in the old high school and junior high where I went to high school. So it was converted to apartments in the late 1990s, but it needed rehab. So they ended up doing this. And so they project based. So the folks that have the voucher now have a landlord that already knows that they're going to accept that voucher. So it eliminates that step of housing search. And I just kind of want to say, since it's public, this was very emotional for me because 3 generations of my family went to school in this facility. So it's where my parents met. So I might not have been there, but my 3 of my grandparents went there. My grandfather was mayor of my hometown for 18 years. So my mom was city clerk. So collectively, we have over 100 years of public service in my 3 generations of family. So it was really kind of neat to come. I made a comment that I was a carefree teenager running through these halls, never knew anything about HUD, but coming back 40, 50 years later to see what I had become a career of working in housing and urban development, to see that benefit not only veterans, but the whole community of having affordable housing in my hometown. So it was pretty cool. So I think those are the types of things that we do, is that we make those matches to make it easier to use the HUD programs when we find hurdles, like not finding landlords, that we grease the skids for these veterans to be able to use the resources that we're making available to them.
So you really came full circle.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, listen, I want to make another call for audience questions. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. And we do have a question. And Todd, it is for you. So here it is. Brace yourself. How is government involved in the jobs outreach for fabs being built through CHIPS? Do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So how is the government involved in jobs outreach for fabs being built through CHIPS?
Yeah, I think in a few ways. Number one, as I said, we are requiring, as part of both our application process and our engagement with applicants and our due diligence process, to really understand and push and require that effort very clearly in terms of what these companies are doing, how they're engaging with the regions to make outreach, how they're planning to break down barriers for different populations to access jobs, requirement to work with certain institutions and formally create intermediaries in some of these regions, including a signed MOU. So through the application process itself, we are able to push, work with, incent, create requirements that these companies, and I believe strongly in workforce development, has to be, demand has to come together with the supply. It can't just be on the schools or the regions. And so we have a unique opportunity, because we are working with private companies, to really bring them, force them, incent them to come to the table with very specific plans, outreach, relationships, and MOUs and contracts. So that's one very important part of what we're doing. We're trying not to do it ourselves. We're trying to create the incentives, the monetary incentives, and the other carrots and sticks to make sure that this is happening in a way that over time becomes sustainable and becomes driven by the local regions and the companies in those regions. That's one. Number two, we have our own teams, workforce team and a community engagement team that is proactively on the ground every day, trying to engage with the various stakeholders, from the training programs, the community colleges, the universities, the local, state, and county executives, economic development offices, workforce development offices, to try to get all of us to be connected. I do find, I have not been in government for 33 years like Jim has been, but I do find one of the more complicated aspects of government is how do we get both at the federal level agencies to work together, and then at the federal, state, local level, those different stakeholders to work together in a seamless way where we're all sort of rowing in the same direction. We've tried to take that very seriously and do our own outreach, do our own connections, do our own building of relationships so that we can help make sure that ecosystem is coming together. And then the third way, the CHIPS Act is constructed, it's got $50 billion. What I'm talking about here is $39 billion of it. The other $11 billion is for research and development, and includes a public-private partnership, the NSTC. And what's in part of the NSTC is going to be a workforce center of excellence that is going to live on, hopefully forever. What that workforce center of excellence will ultimately do is to help all of these regions, all of these companies over time, to spread best practices, to monitor the kind of results that are really working, so that can then be spread across the ecosystem, to find schools and curriculum that are really doing something unique and differentiated and pass that on. And so over time, that overall ecosystem becomes sustainable with an organization that is helping to spread those best practices.
So you're trying to create something really lasting. Yeah.
That's the goal. Again, I mean, I go back to the original thought, like this is unlike what Carolee is talking about, EDA, which is really about sort of broadly supporting underserved communities across the country. Our program starts with this economic and national security imperative. That is the primary purpose. It's not a job creation program. It's not, but as a result of it, it has the ability to drive job creation, to drive economic development. I was in Syracuse 2 weeks ago with the president announcing our over $6 billion award to Micron. And if you've been to Syracuse lately, like that area is really struggling once Carrier left that area, et cetera. And to see the excitement around what this kind of investment can mean for families, workers of all types across that region, from construction workers to fab workers to suppliers to restaurateurs to small businesses, it's quite exciting. And so using the goal of national and economic security to help drive that local economic development and workforce development and broad-based, inclusive economy for all is really what our goal is, and to have that be sustainable without us. We are like a new industrial policy, if you will, but there's the CHIPS Act. We're going to run out of money. There's no guarantee of a CHIPS Act 2 or anything else, and so the ultimate goal is that when our money goes away, that these companies, these fabs, these ecosystems can self-sustain themselves and continue to have a virtuous cycle.
We shall see. That's a really laudable goal. So getting to another audience question, and any one of you can jump in on this. Don't fight over it. But it's a question I probably should have asked. Again, this is for any of you. What have you learned in your time of public service that has surprised you or might surprise someone not in government? So I'll just repeat the question. What have you learned in your time in public service that has surprised you or would surprise someone who has not worked in government? Anybody want to take that one?
I would say for me, it's the pace at which things move. As a person who's always been results driven, it's tough when you enter into a space where you know what the end goal is, and it can take longer than anticipated for various reasons when there become layers of bureaucracy internally, just for a number of just the nature of the way government works. So coming in with big lofty goals and eye on the prize that you want to see results immediately sometimes go a little bit unsatisfied when it takes a little bit longer, but the overarching goal will be great once it gets there. But it's those little pieces that you have to make sure are done the correct way in between, that people outside of government don't realize that there are so many I's to dot, so many T's to cross to get to that end goal, that oftentimes to the outside works, it looks like the government is stale or not working, but really the cogs are moving just at a pace that externally people don't see. And so being able to keep those conversations alive and keep people interested in the things that you're doing and the priorities that you set out, you will eventually reach the goal. You'll eventually reach the goal, but it's sometimes hard when you're a results-driven person to have that wait time to see that end result. For me, that's been the biggest surprise. I thought that things would work a little bit quicker if you had somebody like really shepherding, but didn't realize how many internal processes there were.
I would say, unlike Jim and unlike Jim, I had almost a 30-year career in the private sector. I worked for a large private equity investment firm for nearly 25 years. I come from a world where there is a high degree of skepticism about the ability of government to, operate effectively. So I feel like I can answer this question. I'd say number one, it's like a, true honor and privilege to do the work I'm doing, and really rewarding in a way I hoped, but surpassing my expectations. For me, a little bit different maybe from Carolee, the quality of the people in government is first rate, from the politicals to the career staff and everything in between. It is, truly impressive. Number two, and maybe it's the nature of the programs I work in, but the pace is actually incredible. I mean, I work really hard in my life. I'm working harder now than I ever have, which, if you know me, is saying something. And I would say that's also true of my colleagues, like the drive, the mission orientation, and the need to get things done in a very short period of time. And the way people approach that is impressive to me, and something I don't think people externally fully appreciate. And then finally, I am, blown away every day by the potential for sustainable impact that federal government done right can have, not only federal, state, local government can have on individual people, on individual communities. I spent a few years in the not-for-profit sector. I obviously spent, a few decades in the private sector. Like, I don't believe there's another place where, there's the potential for world-changing impact that can be had here. And all of those things, I think, surprise me, and when I talk to people in my old world, surprise them as well.
And I think I just want to echo what, before Todd said, I was going to say almost the exact same thing. And it's the quality of the people that we work with, our colleagues, you come in with even though it was 30 years ago, this jaded, oh, the government doesn't work, but guess what? The government does work. I've been impressed with my colleagues. Well, I've worked in Washington, I worked in headquarters, I worked in several field offices. We work out in the field, we work closely with our federal partners. Everyone is just top notch. And I just think that, if you look, there's a survey out that they talk about is like people's view of the government, just writ large it's negative, but when they actually deal with the government, their service level goes way up. It's like top tier. And I think that's what we get to experience within the federal government, is that top notch, because we're interacting with our colleagues every day. And I just think that was kind of, even 30 years ago, I just have so much respect for the people that I work with and that dedicate themselves to public service. And I also we do impact communities. We did a big housing development on the south side of Chicago, and that development spurred a grocery store in a food desert. And we were at the groundbreaking for the grocery store, and I was there, and in a suit and tie, and they're like, this woman walked out of the store because it was open for business, and she just said, "Thank you." And I said, "Thank you for what?" And goes, "Well, you must have had something to do with this, and we just love this grocery store." So we make impacts on people's lives. And so I just think that every day we do that across this country. And that's because we're all dedicated and we're all high quality, just motivated people. And that's what sticks out to me.
Yeah, I can really see that with the three of you. Jim, I'm going to keep you in the hot seat. I'm sorry, but
No
there's
problem.
a question specifically for you. It is, are there programs for nonprofits or community organizations to purchase building to house those in danger of homelessness? How do you work with those local groups? So are there nonprofits or community organizations to purchase buildings to house the homeless, or how do you work with local groups?
So I would say there's a couple of things, and short answer is yes. Like I mentioned, there is a local continuum of care organizations, and most of those are nonprofit organizations. They work collectively to identify needs at the local level and provide housing and services. And they're the ones that apply to HUD for direct money from HUD. So I would urge you, there's on our website at www.hud.gov. If you search homelessness, there are a list of all the continuum of cares. They're in every state. Some of them, there are balance of states, so the state actually runs them. But I would identify with that group to find out what the needs are and what the resources are. But we also provide grants to state and local governments. There's over 1,500 grantees that receive our community development block grant and our home investment program dollars. So it's a good way for a local nonprofit to engage their community to see if there are resources. They go through an annual planning process. They have to identify their needs. So there is money available through state and local governments to acquire properties. We also we don't get them as much now, but we do have some inventory of HUD-owned properties that we sell, and there is a priority for nonprofit organizations to acquire those buildings. Usually they're single-family 1 to 4 unit homes, but you can look at those there's a website called HUDHomestore.gov that you can find those. So there's a variety of resources. I would also go, if there's nonprofits that are interested, contact your local HUD field offices. There's 63 across the country. Again, HUD.gov, you can find the one near you. We're in every single state. We have a field office, so I would encourage folks that are interested to talk to HUD, and we would be happy to connect you to resources.
HUD Home Store.
HUD Homes, that's where you can find HUD-owned property for sale, yeah.
Excellent. Well, we are about out of time. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today. I have certainly learned a lot, and I hope everybody else has too.